Good morning. My name is Todd Chaffee, and I'm a professor here at Calvin College, and I co-direct the Calvin Prison Initiative. And what you just heard is the Handlin Tabernacle Choir. And so the Calvin Prison Initiative takes place at the Richard Handlin facility. And the guys in our program, these are all CPI students, they wanted to form a choir. They named it the Handlin Tabernacle Choir. And they sing at special events, and this is a special event. And that song that they sang is their own arrangement. So they actually wrote the music and put the words to it. Throughout the conference today, you will be hearing a lot from our CPI students by way of video. They will be doing video introductions of our speakers, and they will have a video statement on restorative justice. The reason we are here today is because of our Handlin students. Last year, they came up with the idea of having a conference on restorative justice and prison reform. And we didn't really know what we were getting into, but we said, sure, let's give this a try. And overwhelmingly, we had over 300 people attend that conference. So our students said, let's do it again this year. And so here we are at the second annual West Michigan Restorative Justice Conference. We have had several partners in these efforts last year and this year, including the St. Benedict Society and Hope College, and we've expanded now Calvin College and Calvin Seminary, and then of course all of you who are doing great work in your own ministries and organizations, and especially given your support and interest. So, we are excited to kick off our second annual conference. I'd like to begin by inviting Jared Ortiz to come and say a few words. Jared is a professor at Hope College in the religion department, and he was instrumental in making last year's conference happen when we had it at Hope College. So we're delighted that he is here and giving his support again. Also, we have Michael Duttler. Michael Duttler started his education at Hanlon Prison as a Calvin Prison Initiative student. And so he did 3 years in that program, and on May 21st, he graduated in the prison with an associate's degree from Calvin College, and on May 22nd, he was paroled. And that was also his mother's birthday. So he is re-entering. He has spent the summer getting to know folks on the main campus here at Calvin College, and now this fall, he is continuing his education here on the main campus, majoring in social work. And so we're delighted to have Michael here with us. Jared.
So I was asked to say just a few words about how this now annual series of inmate-organized restorative justice conferences came about. And it all started because of a mutual blessing that turned into a friendship. So a few years ago, Eric Boldazar was blessed by an interview with me that he had read in the local Catholic magazine. And he wrote me a letter inviting me to come speak to the Restorative Justice Club at Hanlon. I visited the prison and met a remarkable group of men who were all just singing to you. And the visit blessed me. So Eric and I started exchanging letters, and in an old-fashioned kind of way, we slowly became friends. According to C.S. Lewis, friends sit side by side, looking out on the world. They share at least the same questions, if not the same truths. And I found through our correspondence that Eric and I shared many of the same truths. Our Catholic faith, a devotion to St. Benedict and his spirituality, a desire to live honestly and simply, a hunger and thirst for justice, and a love for wisdom. And it was in the context of this friendship that I was able to receive and act upon Eric's harebrained scheme that we host a conference on restorative justice. So personally, I like harebrained schemes, but honestly, this was one of the hairiest. Still, I like harebrained schemes that build up the kingdom in creative ways, and this scheme did precisely that. It was only because I trusted Eric, because I trusted his mind and heart, trusted his intuitions, that I accepted his offer. But I also realized that Eric had placed great trust in me, trust that I would not let him down, nor let his friends down, trusted that I would not disappoint them and their beautiful vision. So here we are a couple of years later, with one award-winning conference completed and another conference underway. I have many more friends at Hanlon now, and wonders never cease, even friends at Calvin College. And there are many new friendships among the men at Hanlon as well. And God has blessed these friendships and made them fruitful. So my hope for this conference is that you will make new friends based on our shared questions here, that you will deepen the friendships you already have, and that we will all come to love our friends at Hanlon more deeply, and that side by side with them, we can bear witness to the hope that healing and radical reconciliation are possible. Thank you.
Let's take a moment now in prayer, if we would please. God, our Heavenly Father, we just thank you that you are all loving, all merciful, all compassionate, the worker of every good work. We thank you for the ways in which you have worked through all the people who have coordinated in this Restorative Justice Conference. You know them by name, Lord, and you have called them by name. We thank you for that work which has been brought to culmination in this day. We ask, Lord, for your blessing upon this conference, upon all those who attend in person, as well as all those who are attending in spirit, in particular my brothers at Hamlin Correctional. We just ask, Lord, that this day would not just be one day, but many days ahead, that our work and our efforts towards radical hospitality and forgiveness would extend into our lives and into our spheres, bringing about your kingdom, your purposes, and your plans, but especially this day. Just bless, Lord, every talk, every speaker, every ear that hears, every heart that understands, that you would be known and magnified and glorified. We ask and pray this all in Jesus' most holy name. Amen.
And now we'll have a word of introduction from our students on the Hamlin campus.
We want to thank everyone for taking the time to attend the second annual Restorative Justice Conference. Last year's conference was the beginning of a movement here in West Michigan, and its theme, Radical Hospitality, has inspired a new way to view restorative justice. Radical hospitality engages the other, seeking to overcome racial, ethnic, class, and gender differences, redefining who our neighbor is, and providing not only acceptance, but friendship. With that in mind, we will look forward to this year's conference and a deepening of the restorative justice paradigm. So welcome.
We'd like to open with our scriptural mandate, 2 Corinthians 5:18. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Nothing lasting can be accomplished outside of the Lord and his will.
Everything we do here is done under his guidance and direction. All of us are called to conform ourselves to Jesus Christ and to live out a ministry of reconciliation. We hope that you being here with us is the beginning of a new journey towards the kingdom.
This year's theme is radical reconciliation. We are convicted that given the current state of our criminal justice system, radical reconciliation is a vital step on the road to true restorative justice. As Nelson Mandela said, forgiveness liberates the soul. It removes fear. That is why it is such a powerful weapon. Radical reconciliation uses this powerful weapon to fight the war against a failed and oppressive system.
Radical reconciliation and restorative justice are not concepts dreamed up by offenders, hoping to garner sympathy or leniency. These are major movements, both in the United States and abroad. People around the world, from Canada to Rwanda to New Zealand and Australia, and from all eras, from abolitionists to suffragists to civil rights activists, have thrown their abilities and efforts behind restorative justice and reconciliation.
The concept of reconciliation has been tackled by restorative justice advocates and authors such as Christopher Marshall and Robin Kazarjian. It has been major importance from post-Africa apartheid and the work of former head of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church, Alan Bosak, and Professor Curtis DeYoung, to Latin America and the work of social activists. Reconciliation and restorative justice are being rethought and redefined, and we encourage you to join the conversation, not only in words, but in actions.
A lot of you may be wondering just what is meant by the phrase radical reconciliation. The truth is, there is no pat or simple answer. The phrase is intentionally dynamic. It is meant to stir the imagination, to inspire the spirit, and spur action. Radical reconciliation is never easy. It involves intentionality. It requires us to go out of our way to develop relationships. It calls us to move beyond our own sphere of influence to a greater community of humanity, a global community of shalom. But most importantly, radical reconciliation is fundamentally tied to the saving work that God is doing in the world. It is cosmic in scope and not limited to Sundays at church or those of our faith, our limited circle of friends, or even the small inch of creation that we inhabit.
Christ calls all of us to be his redemptive agents here on earth, and nothing should prevent us from this work. We are commissioned to engage in radical hospitality and reconciliation whenever and wherever it is needed. Radical reconciliation reveals that everyone is our neighbor, and it provides a touchstone of hope and healing to victims of crime, the community, and to the offenders who are all too often considered disposable and thrown away in our consumer-driven society.
We stand at the cusp of a new day, a time in which many people are beginning to recognize the failures of the retributive justice system. Consider this: over 2 million people are incarcerated in the United States of America. Over 7 million are on probation or parole, and a disproportionate 67% of those in contact with the criminal justice system are minorities.
In Michigan, a prisoner will serve 120% of their minimum sentence. All of these statistics establish the underlying truth that retributive justice harms families of both victims and offenders, while depriving communities of valuable assets in the form of rehabilitated men and women, without providing any added benefit in the form of safety and security.
By contrasting the failures of retributive justice system with new statistics from areas which are beginning to practice large-scale restorative justice, it becomes clear that this is a chance that will benefit all of society. Restorative justice practices have a 20% higher satisfaction rate with victims than traditional justice practices.
Restorative justice helps victims by creating a greater feeling of safety and vindication, which in turn results in victims who are 15 to 20% less likely to fear re-victimization and 25% less angry with offenders. One of the primary tools of restorative justice is victim-offender mediation. Of the 116 programs across the U.S., 87% resulted in agreements, and 99% of those were completed.
Not only does restorative justice aid victims, it substantially reduces recidivism rates, demonstrating its effectiveness in driving offender rehabilitation. The Longmont Community Justice Partnership is an initiative that has been active for 20 years, is comprised of 20 judicial districts, logs 3,500 volunteer hours a year, and serves 125 crime victims and 225 offenders. This initiative produces a 7% recidivism rate compared to a national average in excess of 2/3. That's an unmitigated success.
There are both spiritual and political roots in the concept of reconciliation. Originally, it was used in a Greek and Roman peace treaties. Paul redefined it as God's saving work through Jesus Christ, the way in which humanity can be made right with God again.
All too often, worldly powers has co-opted the word, and underlying theological concepts it embodies, in an attempt to perpetuate oppressive system by providing a venue of spirituality. Today, we want to begin redefining reconciliation and the underlying concepts again.
While addressing the issue of race in America, presidential hopeful Barack Obama said, "I believe deeply that we cannot solve the challenges of our times unless we perfect our union of understanding that we may have different stories, but we have common hopes. That we may not look the same, and we may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction, towards a better future for our children and our grandchildren." For us, that exemplifies radical reconciliation. Victims, communities, and offenders are equally affected by crime, and their constituents have common hopes for a better future for future generations. A better future will only be possible when the criminal justice system has been made truly just and more equitable. That is a primary aim of the restorative justice movement.
Alan Bozek and Curtis DeYoung tell us that reconciliation can be understood as an exchanging places with the other, overcoming alienation through identification, solidarity, restoring relationships, positive change, new frameworks, and a rich togetherness that is both spiritual and political. However, reconciliation requires more than leaving places of power for periodic visits to communities of oppressed people. Reconciliation requires more than inviting persons from the margins to visit for conversations in places of comfort. It means ongoing relationships with many persons from marginalized communities. It means engaging such relationships for the duration of our lives. So powerful is the lure of privilege, and so long the shadow of power.
With this in mind, it is clear that reconciliation must be with those who are most at risk, the disinherited, the oppressed, and the marginalized. Further, reconciliation must both equip and empower them, not just to participate in the community, but to thrive as they live in the fullness of God and flourish as God's children. We believe that changing the systemic injustice that exists begins in the community and extends into and out of the prison.
Desmond Tutu observed that true reconciliation is never cheap, for it is based on forgiveness, which is costly. Forgiveness in turn depends on repentance, which has to be based on acknowledgement of what was done wrong, and therefore on disclosure of the truth. You cannot forgive what you do not know. We are committed to holistic practices of reconciliation and ultimately restorative justice. But this cannot be accomplished without your help, without your commitment, and your ideas.
Leo Tolstoy famously observed that everybody thinks of changing humanity and nobody thinks of changing himself. We believe that inner transformation is a vital key to radical reconciliation and ultimately restorative justice itself. Through programs such as Thinking for a Change, Chance for Life, Bridges, Shakespeare Behind Bars, and the Calvin Prison Initiative, many prisoners are striving for inner transformation. Often, those who accomplish their goals will spend the rest of their life in prison helping those who will be released back into society. We hope that as more people come to see the humanity and values of these forgotten men and women, the willingness to discard people will end.
Your willingness to join us here at the conference is the first step towards a world where social justice is the war that has been won, not the battle we must still fight. One of the primary steps in winning the war is altering the way society sees offenders, as Robin Kasarjian writes. When we look beyond our prejudgments and see the potential of growth and healing in others, we have to let go of our static images and assume a more responsible attitude in the way we treat the other person or group. Seeing the marginalized as people in process challenges us as a society to respond to them in a more humane and intelligent way.
Taking this first step begins the process of believing that even offenders can be more than merely prisoners. Once we believe that, it becomes possible to unite the victim and the community with the offender so that nobody is thrown away and forgotten.
Martin Luther King admonished us to be like Christ, telling us, I choose to identify with the underprivileged. I choose to identify with the poor. I choose to give my life for hunger. I choose to give my life for those who have left behind out of the sunlight of opportunity. This is the way I'm going. If it means suffering a little bit, I'm going that way. If it means sacrificing, I'm going that way. If it means dying for them, I'm going that way. Because I heard a voice saying, do something for others.
True radical reconciliation may seem like an enormous challenge. The road to healing and reconciliation is never easy. It requires both humility and courage. It is the work of both restorative justice and radical love. The road of healing and reconciliation is the road we are all called to walk. But as you will see, we do not walk the road alone. We pray that you'll enjoy the conference.
As your MC for today, I have a very easy job. In a moment, I'm going to invite Dr. Nick Wolterstorff up to the podium, but I don't have to do any of the introductions today for any of our speakers, because those introductions have been taken care of by our students on the Handlin campus.
It is my great honor to introduce Professor Nicholas Wolterstorff. In my Introduction to Philosophy course, Professor Kevin Corcoran told the class that Nicholas Wolterstorff is one of the philosophers credited with reinvigorating Christian academic philosophy. He went on to say that 500 years from now, students would still be reading Wolterstorff's work. Professor Wolterstorff has been a guest speaker at Handlin campus, and we consider him a friend of the Calvin Prison Initiative program. We eagerly look forward to hosting him again. He is Noah Porter Professor Emeritus of Philosophical Theology at Yale University and Senior Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. There was a joke going around that if you wanted to hear Nicholas Wolterstorff speak, you would have to go to the prison. He, like Karl Barth, has taken to heart the words spoken by Jesus in Matthew 25:36. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. As a prisoner, I can attest the power of such dedication. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Nicholas Walterstorff.
Thank you for that introduction. Which way do I face? This conference, as you have gathered, was organized by the Calvin students in Hanlon Prison. As the first speaker, sound is okay? As the first speaker, I want to thank and congratulate them in advance for organizing what promises to be an informative and inspiring conference. And I want to thank them in particular for the honor they bestowed on me of inviting me to be the keynote speaker. Prison regulations prevent them from being present at the conference that they have organized, and even prevent them from watching it and listening to it live, regrettably. Let me begin with a personal note, hinted at in the introduction. A few years ago, I participated in Hanlon Prison in the session of a philosophy course that the introducer mentioned. It was the most moving experience of my entire 45-year teaching career. These adult men, most of them lifers, were intelligent and articulate. They engaged the reading material far more intensely than typical college and university students do. And they were far more open about their lives and experience. Their life experience led them to see things in the text that had never occurred to me. After a while, the discussion acquired a life of its own. I was no longer leading it. I was part of it. At the conclusion of the session, they lined up to shake hands with me. I've never experienced this before in any class I've ever taught. Professor Walterstorff, they said, we are so honored that you came to talk with us. After the fourth or fifth of them had said this, I replied with words that expressed what I had intuitively felt, but had not until then been able to articulate. I said, and I was honored that you treated me as one of you, as a friend. It was suggested that in this opening talk, I set the stage for the sessions that are to follow in this conference on restorative justice, hope, healing, and reconciliation. So that's what I will do, set the stage. I will describe in a general way what restorative justice is, leaving it to subsequent speakers to give specificity to my generalizations. I will locate restorative justice within the larger context of justice generally, and I will explain why restorative justice is important. Let me begin by describing for you an episode of restorative justice that occurred in my extended family many years ago when I was in my early 20s. I didn't know at the time that it was a case of restorative justice. This restorative justice movement had not yet begun, but looking back, that's what it was. Went like this. Took place in my hometown of Edgerton, Minnesota, a small village on the prairies of extreme southwest Minnesota. The extended family in question was the family of my stepmother, the Hannenbergs. Most of my Hannenberg cousins and all of my Hannenberg aunts and uncles lived in Edgerton, except for Aunt Clara and her husband who lived in Cleveland, and Uncle Dewey and his wife who lived in Chicago. Now, the Hannenbergs were and are a very intelligent, curious-minded, and articulate family who loved to discuss anything under the sun, anything. They were and are not afraid of disagreements, but the disagreements were always in the context of love. When it was time to part ways, they embraced. On one occasion, Uncle Dewey and his wife Christine invited Aunt Clara and her husband Bill to ride with them from Chicago to visit the relatives in Edgerton. Dewey and Christine were very conservative in their political views. Clara and Bill were very progressive. On the way, Clara and Bill got into an intense argument about politics. Dewey went beyond expressing his disagreement with Clara's views to insulting her. When they got to Edgerton, Clara, still feeling very bruised and deeply hurt, told the relatives what had happened. I suppose she told her brothers and sisters, my aunts and uncles first, but we, nephews and nieces, soon heard about the episode as well. And we determined that this breach in the family should not be allowed to fester unhealed. So we talked to Dewey, told him that he had to apologize to Clara, talked to Clara, and asked her if she'd be willing to accept his apology if he did apologize. We then got them in the same room, seated them facing each other. Dewey apologized. Clara forgave him. They stood up and embraced, tears flowing. I, too, had tears in my eyes, as I would guess did everybody else in the room. Let me highlight 3 features of what happened there in that living room long ago that are definitive of restorative justice in general. First, the breach was regarded as a breach in the extended family, not just a breach between Dewey and Clara. The extended family got involved. Second, Dewey was not punished. We didn't think punishment was necessary. And in any case, what would it have looked like? Third, the effect of the combination of apology and forgiveness was repair of the breach and reconciliation. In words from the title of this conference, the result was healing and radical reconciliation. So now let me move on to locate restorative justice within justice in general. Already in Greek antiquity, the distinction was drawn between 2 fundamentally different kinds of justice. One is justice in our ordinary relations with each other. Teachers and students treating each other justly, nurses and patients treating each other justly, and so forth. In my writings, I've sometimes called this form of justice primary justice and sometimes first-order justice. I'm going to use the second term today. The other form of justice, second form of justice, becomes relevant when there's been a violation of first-order justice. I've never hit on what I regard as a fully satisfactory term for the second form of justice, but let me just call it second-order justice. Traditionally, it was called retributive justice. I resist calling it that, mainly because on my view, which I won't defend this morning, mainly because on my view, it's my view that retribution, paying back, is always wrong. So restorative justice is a type of that second kind of justice, second order justice. It becomes relevant when there's been a violation of first order justice, when somebody has insulted somebody, when somebody has stolen something from somebody, and so forth. Second order justice, typically, in our world, takes the form of punishment. Punishment being the imposition of some kind of hard treatment on somebody for their having wronged someone, for their having treated somebody unjustly. In different societies, as you know, and in different times, the hard treatment has taken many different forms. Whipping, public mockery, exile, shunning, banning, torture, imprisonment, execution, and more besides. Now, it's commonly assumed that punishment is a just response to an act of wrongdoing. Of course, it can be and often is a violation of how a person should be treated, and is in that way unjust. But punishment of the right sort, so it is commonly assumed, is a just response to an act of wrongdoing. And why is that? Why is the imposition of hard treatment on the wrongdoer thought to be a just response to the wrongdoing? What's the point? The rationale? That question has received a number of different answers over the centuries and continues to do so, which indicates that the answer to the question is not just obvious. Among the most common, maybe indeed the most common rationales for punishment is what I'll call the retribution rationale. Justice requires that the injury the wrongdoer imposed on his victim be repaid with an equivalent hard treatment imposed on him. The wrongdoer deserves to be punished. One hears this all the time. He's getting what he deserves. Now, I dare say that most people in the contemporary world who believe that wrongdoers deserve retribution wouldn't be able to say, and why is that? Why must harm be repaid with harm? Why do wrongdoers deserve to be punished? Writers in the ancient world had an answer. Sounds kind of odd to us, but they had an answer. They thought that wrongdoing creates an imbalance in the moral or the legal order, and that the order has to be restored to balance by answering harm with harm. The retribution rationale. Let me briefly mention three other rationales for punishment. They're familiar to all of you. There is, secondly, the reform rationale. It's thought that the point of imposing hard treatment on a wrongdoer is to reform him or her. This was the rationale behind the institution of so-called penitentiaries and reformatories in the U.S., across the U.S., in the 19th century. And it's behind what I learned to be the official name of Hanlon Prison, namely Hanlon Correctional Facility. The point of incarcerating wrongdoers, so it's been thought, or punishing them in some other way, is to induce penitence, to reform them, to correct them. A third familiar rationale for punishment is, let's call it the deterrence rationale. The point of imposing hard treatment on a wrongdoer is to deter others from doing what he did. And a fourth rationale for imposing a certain kind of hard treatment on certain kinds of wrongdoers is the protection rationale. Society has to be protected from this person doing the same thing again, so we lock them up. Now consider all four of those rationales together. Retribution, reform, deterrence, and protection. And then notice that the fundamental point of all of them is to uphold, each in its own way, the order of law, the order of moral, civil, or institutional law. By giving wrongdoers what they deserve, by reforming them so that they no longer do what they did, by deterring others, by protecting society, the order of law is upheld. You see, wrongdoing is thought to be not only a violation of the order of law, but a threat to it. And the point of punishment is to protect the order against the threat. Deterrence, reform, protection, retribution, and so forth. And now I can bring restorative justice into the picture. Did you notice that in the four rationales for punishment as a response to wrongdoing that I mentioned, no mention was made of the victim? When someone commits an act of wrongdoing, he not only violates the order of moral, civil, or institutional law, he also wrongs somebody, wrongs a person. He wreaks a breach in personal relationships. Punishment pays no attention to these breaches in personal relationships. When the prisoner is released, if he is released, he enters a situation of ongoing alienation from those he wronged. By contrast, restorative justice focuses on healing the breach in personal relationships. It does not deny that punishment is sometimes desirable, even necessary, but its focus is not on upholding moral, civil, or institutional law by punishing the wrongdoer. Its focus is on healing the breach in relationship between wrongdoer and victim. When one person has wronged another, how can the breach between them be healed? only by the wrongdoer acknowledging the wrong he has done, by taking responsibility for it, by repenting of it, by expressing his repentance in the form of apology and, when relevant, making amends, and by the victim accepting the apology and forgiving the wrongdoer for what he did to her. When that interpersonal transaction takes place, the breach is healed and the parties are reconciled. That makes it sound easy. The wrongdoer apologizes, the victim forgives, the parties are reconciled. But often it's not at all easy. The wrongdoer resists taking responsibility for the wrong he did and resists apologizing. He couldn't help it, he says, or it wasn't his fault, or the victim had it coming, so forth. Or the victim resists forgiving. May you, the wrongdoer, rot in hell for what you did to me. So this is where the work of those who labor for restorative justice comes into the picture. The work of trying to bring the resistant wrongdoer to the point where he takes responsibility for the wrong he did and apologizes and makes amends. And the work of trying to bring the resistant victim to the point where she's able and willing to forgive. Often it's hard work and takes a long time. And what contributes to the difficulty in many cases is that there are officials and individuals who urge the wrongdoer not to apologize and who urge the victim not to forgive. Often those who urge the victim not to forgive are friends and relatives. And that points to the fact that though I have spoken of the breach wreaked by wrongdoing as a breach between wrongdoer and victim, that's misleading. The harm wreaked by wrongdoing typically affects not just the one directly victimized, but her family, her friends, her co-workers, her fellow church members. Wrong spreads out. So the healing that has to take place is correspondingly spread out. Those others have to be brought into the picture. Recall my opening example of Aunt Clara, Uncle Dewey, and the extended family. Why engage in this hard work? Why not just lock them up and be done with it? Why not focus on the law that's been violated and ignore the person who's been wronged? Before I answer that question, let me make two explanatory comments. The first is this. Earlier I said that restorative justice is a type of second-order justice. It becomes relevant when there's been a violation of first-order justice. Notice I did not say that restorative justice is a special example of criminal justice, because it's not. Restorative justice is relevant whenever someone has wronged another person. It is relevant when the wronging takes the form of a crime, but it's also relevant when the wronging takes the form of violating the rules of some institution. And that's why a good many people in this audience have been working to get the schools in Grand Rapids to institute restorative justice practices. And as the example with which I began also makes clear, restorative justice is relevant when the wronging doesn't even take the form of violating some law or institutional regulation, just personal relationships. The second explanatory comment that I want to make at this point pertains to how forgiveness is to be understood in this context. Some years back, I discovered that there are two quite different understandings of forgiveness current in our society. The discovery happened in the following way. I had given a talk in which I laid out what I understood to be the nature of forgiveness, and I closed the talk by raising the question of whether it's possible genuinely to forgive someone for the wrong they did one if they refuse to repent or make amends. Is that possible? I did not give a decisive answer to that question. In the question period after my talk, a person in the audience with an extremely puzzled look on her face asked me why, in my analysis of forgiveness, I had brought the wrongdoer into the picture. The wrongdoer has nothing to do with forgiveness, she said. Forgiveness doesn't have anything to do with reconciliation. I was as baffled by that response as she was baffled by my talk. So I asked her to say more. She repeated that forgiveness has nothing to do with reconciliation. The victim has to get on with her life. She has to get to the point where the wrong done to her no longer festers, no longer shapes her life. When she gets to that point, she has forgiven. It doesn't matter what the wrongdoer thinks or says or does. I remain baffled until another person jumped into this discussion and explained that that's how forgiveness is understood, typically understood, in what she called the therapeutic tradition. And that opened my eyes. There are, then, two very different understandings of forgiveness current in our culture. On one of them, forgiveness is an action that engages the wrongdoer, victim engaging the wrongdoer, and it aims at reconciliation. On the other understanding, forgiveness is a purely internal psychological process that aims at getting on with one's life. The title of this conference, Restorative Justice, Hope, Healing, and Reconciliation, makes clear, especially in that last word, that the former understanding of forgiveness, a personal interaction, is the one that the restorative justice movement works with. Okay, so to come to a conclusion, in my comments thus far, I've tried to set the stage for the talks that are to follow by briefly describing what restorative justice is and by locating it within a larger picture of other forms of justice. So let me close by asking, why is restorative justice important? Sometimes it's not relevant. Sometimes it isn't successful. And when it is successful, the process is often lengthy and messy. So why bother? Where there's been an infraction of some moral, civil, or institutional law, why not uphold the law by advocating or imposing punishment of some sort? And let it go at that. Why not? Well, restorative justice aims, as we've seen several times over now, at healing and reconciliation. Healing and reconciliation. Healing the breach in personal relationships that wrongdoing wreaks, and becoming reconciled. So the importance one assigns to restorative justice depends entirely on the importance one assigns to healing and reconciliation. Now, clearly, many members of our society do desire healing and reconciliation when they've been personally wronged by a family member, a friend, a co-worker. But in my experience, often their interest in healing and reconciliation doesn't go beyond those personal cases. So what do you say to one of those? Why is restorative justice in general important? One does not have to be religious to regard healing and reconciliation as important. But as for myself, when I'm asked why I think they are important, I have no way of answering other than to appeal to my own Christian convictions. The 20th century German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, A-R-E-N-D-T, Hannah Arendt, wrote in her book, The Human Condition, that, quote, the discoverer of the role of forgiveness in the realm of human affairs was Jesus of Nazareth, end of quote. I think it's not quite true that it was Jesus who discovered the role of forgiveness in human affairs. One finds occasional references to forgiveness in the Hebrew Bible Old Testament. What is the case, however, beyond a doubt, is that it was in the teachings of Jesus and in the letters of the New Testament that forgiveness became prominent. Jesus taught his disciples one day that if one is wronged by someone who then repents one must forgive him. And if he does the same thing 7 times in a day, you must forgive him 7 times. The disciples found this teaching baffling and disturbing. So after discussing it among themselves, one of them came back to Jesus and said, Master, if my brother sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus gave a hyperbolic reply. Not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. What he meant, of course, is that whenever a wrongdoer repents of what he did to you, forgive, no matter how many times. Jesus' disciples asked him to teach them how to pray. Included in the prayer Jesus taught them is the petition, forgive us for the wrongs we have done you, O Lord, as we forgive those who have wronged us. Those are just 2 of lots of passages I could cite, establishing that fundamental in the way of life that Jesus taught his followers was reconciliation between wrongdoer and victim, achieved by the combination of repentance and forgiveness. Working for restorative justice is not optional. Given this teaching of Jesus, the prominence in the New Testament of this teaching of Jesus, and given the prominence of Christianity in this country from the time of its beginnings, I find it inexplicable excuse me, that the restorative justice movement did not emerge in this country until the 1970s. Why is it that, for centuries, we focused exclusively on the law that was violated by wrongdoing and on punishment as a way of upholding the order of law? Why did we turn our face away from the victim and from the breach in personal relationships that wrongdoing wreaks? Aren't persons more important than laws? Aren't laws for the sake of persons? Why didn't we all these centuries work for reconciliation, for restorative justice? I don't know the answer to that question. Thanks.
We have time for a few questions or comments that this talk may have sparked. I'm curious, are there any questions or comments? Yes, please.
We need mics here.
One aspect of forgiveness that wasn't covered in your talk, and it's incorporated into a Hebrew ritual that I think is called Teshua.
I'm staying close.
Okay. All right. So I'm not sure how this would fit in an institutional setting of restorative justice, but one view on forgiveness is that it isn't genuine unless the victim is convinced that the wrongdoer has changed and it won't happen again. So making amends and repenting takes you so far, but unless the person really believes the person isn't going to repeat the wrong, it's not really genuine forgiveness. And the time frame in which an institution can provide reconciliation may be too short for that to occur.
They're sick of this one problem. This one's still working? You raise a really interesting and difficult question. Okay, suppose we're dealing with suppose the person who wronged me is really a very conflicted, troubled person. Hard to get his life in control and so forth. So he's wronged me. And I think that he's really, really sorry for doing it. But given his character, I kind of think he might well do it again. He's got some kind of addiction or whatever. So it looks to me as if I can really forgive. It looks to me as if forgiveness sometimes has to be sort of case specific rather than what I call the other person specific. I say, Joe, I really forgive you for this. I might shut up then, or I might say, but we got to talk, because I fear that you're going to do the same thing again. So I think I really have forgiven him, but your point is that it's got a kind of incompleteness about it, and that's absolutely true. We haven't reached full reconciliation. We've only reached this case reconciliation. Make sense?
Yes. Question over here. There's a mic there.
Hello, my name is Elena Gormley, and I'm a member of Congregation Ahavas Israel. And the previous questioner mentioned teshuvah, and teshuvah is a process. So you start by recognizing and regretting that you did something wrong, and then you have to, and it's an action, so you do teshuvah, so you have to work to reconcile and fix what you did wrong. And traditionally within Jewish minhag, you're obligated to try and apologize and reconcile at least 3 times. So if someone says, I don't forgive you, you have to go back, maybe you do some more teshuvah, you come back again at least 3 times. So it is an ongoing process. And the other thing I just wanted to point out is that I think you sold the Tanakh a little bit short. There is quite a few references to God forgiving people as soon as they ask quite a bit in the Hebrew Bible, and it's a very major part of any Yom Kippur service. Which also interesting thing about Yom Kippur is that when you speak the prayer of confession, Al Het, everything is we did this. We have sinned by all of this, so it's the understanding that this is also a communal process, that it's not just about me, that the entire community must do teshuvah and fix wrongdoing.
Good point. Yeah, the Old Testament doesn't talk very often about forgiveness among human beings, but it does talk about God's forgiveness. And so I've always thought that Hannah Arendt exaggerated a little, which is a bit odd because, as I mentioned, Hannah Arendt was herself Jewish, and that she thought that it was Jesus who discovered forgiveness. Has always surprised me a bit, but so it is.
I wonder, Nick, I'm curious that your talk puts emphasis on individuals.
Oh, I wasn't listening, Todd.
Yeah, sorry. On individuals.
Yep.
So one individual to another individual. I wonder the role of a community for restorative justice. So I'm just thinking in terms of even the work that we do at the Handlin Prison. A lot of this requires multiple sets of relationships, and your opening illustration bears that out. And so I do think that for restorative justice to occur at an institutional level, say, it would have to assume, in part, a community that understands what restorative justice is, what it requires, and then is willing to do the hard work. So, for instance, from your Christian conviction, the church. One-to-one restoration is never one-to-one.
Yep.
It always requires a kind of thick set of relationships with a community. I wonder if you'd reflect on that, or because your talk emphasized, it seemed to me, more one-to-one, the individuals involved.
Though I meant my opening story of Uncle Dewey and Aunt Clara and the nephews and nieces and everybody getting involved to be a suggestion anyway that the breach in question almost always spreads out. There are others injured, the children are injured, and so forth. So yes, my understanding of the origins of the restorative justice movement is that it began in part in some of the native tribes in Canada where the members of the tribe felt very acutely that the tribe had been injured, not just these two people, and they got the members of the tribe, a counselor or whatever, all together. So that from its very beginnings, the restorative justice movement has recognized the communal quality, the communal character of wronging, and consequently the necessary communal character of reconciliation. So I did mislead a little bit by talking about wrongdoer and victim. Yes, but victims.
Yeah.
I mean, Uncle Dewey insulted Clara. He didn't insult me, but it had this rippling effect on the rest of us.
Right. I recall from last year's conference a talk given by the professor from the University of Minnesota where he does restorative justice work between victimizer and victim, and he said it often will take a year of having multiple people involved to help that act come to fruition. And so it dawned on me, that this is really, it takes multiple players to feel a sense of involvement and obligation that this bears on all of us. So I think it was very important, that idea.
And no doubt, one of the reasons that, among the many reasons that our society has always favored punishment over reconciliation, is that you don't have to get all these relatives involved and so forth. You just punish that one person. You don't have to talk. You don't have to talk to all these other. You don't have to talk to the kids, to the wife.
No, that's right. That's right. Yes, over here. Please, yes.
My name is Tina Marua, and I am a restorative facilitator at Kellogg'sville Middle School. And your final question in your talk was, about why we gravitated towards punishment versus a restorative process. And I think I see the answer to that every day in my school, which is that punishment is easy and fast. Reconciliation and restoration of relationships is a long, ongoing process, and we are feeling the pressure of dealing with an incident quickly. So I think that it's basically facility that drives us to go that route. I wanted to build on what you were talking about with community, which is that community is also harmed, as you pointed out, but community is also the harmer. I think a lot of the men in the video are not only responsible for causing harm to their communities, but their communities are responsible for causing harm to them. And the restorative process has to recognize not just the harm that is caused by individual to individual and individual to community, but community to individual. And I think that's part of the reconciliation. Has to include an acknowledgement that those who have caused harm also have been harmed.
Yeah. Good point. Good point.
Hi, my name is Charmaine Char. I'm a lawyer from Singapore, and I'm studying public policy and social work at the University of Michigan right now. And I just wanted to kind of contribute to the conversation and ask a bit further about how you think restorative justice could be not just a spiritual act, but also a social and political act. And I think that's also kind of pointing back to the fact that there's many factors in society that may cause certain people to be more likely to either have certain actions criminalized or to kind of not have positive alternatives that allow them to kind of productively live out their lives. So I would just like to hear you speak a bit more about this whole aspect of how restorative justice holds the community accountable as well.
More about what?
How restorative justice holds the community accountable. how restorative justice holds the community accountable as a social and political act as well.
Oh, I don't have a very good answer to that one. That's how do you think?
So my personal thoughts on this is that having the offender tell their story as well is a way to give a face to things that are happening in society that have kind of, on the surface, they've erupted as a crime, but there's also many factors below that. And sometimes, especially if victims are in more privileged parts of society, that can be a way for the victim also to engage in wider society and the things that are happening.
I want to thank Professor Waltersdorf for opening us this morning with his talk.